Chapter 12, Part 2 of The Sinking of the Titanic and Great Sea Disasters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Sinking of the Titanic and Great Sea Disasters. Edited by Logan Marshall. Chapter 12, Part 2. The following list of the survivors and dead contains the latest revisions and corrections of the White Star Line officials and was furnished by them exclusively for this book. List of survivors. First cabin. Anderson, Harry. Antoinette, Miss. Apironelt, Miss. Appleton, Mrs. E.D. Abbott, Mrs. Rose. Allison, Master and Nurse. Andrews, Miss Cornelia I. Allen, Miss E.W. Astor, Mrs. John Jacob and maid. Albert, Monsieurs N. and maid. Barrett, Carl B. Bisette, Miss. Barkworth, A.H. Bucknell, Mrs. W. Bowerman, Miss E. Brown, Mrs. J.J. Burns, Miss C.M. Bishop, Mr. and Mrs. D.H. Blank, H. Bessina, Miss A. Baxter, Mrs. James. Brayton, George. Bonnell, Miss Lily. Brown, Mrs. J.M. Bowen, Miss G.C. Beckwith, Mr. and Mrs. R.L. Bisley, Mr. and Mrs. Bonnell, Miss C. Cassibier, Mrs. H.A. Cardeza, Mrs. J.W. Candell, Mrs. Churchill. Case, Howard B. Camerion, Kennard. Casaboro, Miss D.D. Clark, Mrs. W.M. Chabinas, Mrs. B.C. Charlton, W.M. Crosby, Mrs. E.G. Carter, Mrs. Lucille. Calderhead, E.P. Chandanson, Miss Victoria. Cavendish, Mrs. Terrell and maid. Chaffee, Mrs. H.I. Cardeza, Mr. Thomas. Cummings, Mrs. J. Chevry, Paul. Cherry, Miss Gladys. Chambers, Mr. and Mrs. N.C. Carter, Mr. and Mrs. W.E. Carter, Master William. Compton, Mrs. A.T. Compton, Miss S.R. Crosby, Mrs. E.G. Crosby, Miss Harriet. Cornell, Mrs. R.C. Chibnall, Mrs. E. Douglas, Mrs. Fred. De Villiers, Monsieur. Daniel, Miss Sarah. Daniel, Robert W. Davidson, Mr. and Mrs. Thornton and family. Douglas, Mrs. Walter and maid. Dodge, Miss Sarah. Dodge, Mrs. Washington and son. Dick, Mr. and Mrs. A.A. Danielle, H. Heron. Drossinstead, A. Dally, Peter D. Andres, Miss Caroline. Ellis, Miss. Earnshaw, Mrs. Bolton. Eustace, Miss E. Emmock, Philip E. Flagenheim, Mrs. Antoinette. Franicatelli, Mizey. Finn, J.I. Fortune, Miss Alice. Fortune, Miss Ethel. Fortune, Mrs. Mark. Fortune, Miss Mabel. Frauenthal, Dr. and Mrs. H.W. Frauenthal, Mr. and Mrs. T.G. Frolicher, Miss Margaret. Frolicher, May and Mrs. Frolicher, Miss N. Futrell, Mrs. Jocks. Gracie, Colonel Archibald. Graham, Mr. and Mrs. William. Graham, Miss M. Gordon, Sir Cosmo Duff. Gordon, Lady. Gibson, Miss Dorothy. Goldenberg, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel. Goldenberg, Miss Ella. Greenfield, Mrs. L.P. Greenfield, G.B. Greenfield, William. Gibson, Mrs. Leonard. Gooch, James. Haven, Mr. Henry B. Harris, Mrs. H.B. Holverson, Mrs. Alex. Hodgeboom, Mrs. J.C. Hawksford, W.J. Harper, Henry and manservant. Harper, Mrs. H.S. Hold, Miss J.A. Hope, Nina. Hoyt, Mr. and Mrs. Fred. Horner, Henry R. Harder, Mr. and Mrs. George. Hayes, Mrs. Charles M. and daughter. Hippach, Miss Jean. Hippach, Mrs. Ida S. Ismay, J. Bruce. Janasco, Mrs. J. Kimball, Mr. and Mrs. Ed N. Kennyman, F. A. Kinchin, Miss Emil. Longley, Miss G. F. Leader, Miss A. F. Leahy, Miss Nora. Lavery, Miss Bertha. Lines, Mrs. Ernest. Lines, Miss Mary. Lindstrom, Mrs. Singard. Lesnure, Gustave Jr. Madill, Miss Georgette A. Mahan, Mrs. Melicard, Monsieurs. Menderson, Miss Leta. May, Miss Roberta. Marvin, Mrs. D.W. Marichel, Pierre. Maroney, Mrs. R. Meyer, Mrs. E.I. Mock, Mr. P.E. Middle, Monsieur M. Ogivi. Minahan, Miss Daisy. Minahan, Mrs. W.E. McGow, James. Newell, Miss Alice. Newell, Miss Madeline. Newell, Washington. Newson, Miss Helen. O'Connell, Miss R. Ostby, E.C. Ostby, Miss Helen. Omond, Fiam. Panhart, Miss Ninette. Piers, Mrs. E. Pomeroy, Miss Ellen. Potter, Mrs. Thomas Jr. Puchin, Major Arthur. Peercott, Miss A. Ryerson, John. Renago, Mrs. Mamam. Ranelt, Miss Appy. Rothschild, Mrs. Lord Martin. Rosenbaum, Miss Edith. Rhymes, Mr. and Mrs. George. Rosibel, Miss H. Rhodes, Countess. Robert, Mrs. Edna. Rolmain, C. Ryerson, Alice Susan P. Ryerson, Miss Emily. Ryerson, Mrs. Arthur and maid. Stone, Mrs. George M. Skeller, Mrs. William. Segaser, Miss Emma. Seward, Fred K. Shutter, Miss. Sloper, William T. Swift, Mrs. J. Joel. Schaubert, Mrs. Paul. Shadell, Robert Douglas. Snyder, Mr. and Mrs. John. Serapica, Alice Augusta. Silvertiern, R. Spencer. Sailfield, Adolph. Stahilin, Max. Seminois, Alphonsus. Smith, Mrs. Lucien P. Stevenson, Mrs. Walter. Solomon, Abraham. Sylvie, Mrs. William B. Stenmel, Mr. and Mrs. Hillary. Spencer, Mrs. W. A. and maid. Slater, Miss Hilda. Spedden, Mr. and Mrs. F. O. and child. Stephenson, H. B. Strauss, Mrs. maid of. Schaubert, Mrs. Emma. Slinter, Mrs. E. Simmons, A. Taylor, Miss. Tucker, Mrs. and maid. Thayer, Miss J.B. Thayer, J.B. Jr. Tossig, Miss Ruth. Tossig, Mrs. E. Thor, Miss Ella. Thorn, Mrs. G. Taylor, Mr. and Mrs. E. Z. Trout, Miss Jessie. Tucker, Gilbert. Woolner, Hugh. Ward, Miss Anna. Williams, Richard M. Jr. Warren, Mrs. P. Wilson, Miss Helen A. Williard, Miss C. Wick, Miss Mary. Wick, Geo. Widener, valet of. Widener, Mrs. George D. and maid. White, Mrs. J. Stewart. Young, Miss Marie. List of survivors, second cabin. Abason, Mrs. Mana. Abbott, Mrs. R. Argenia, Mrs. and 2 children. Angel, F. Angle, William. Balmthorpe, Mrs. L. Balls, Mrs. Ada E. Buss, Miss Kate. Becker, Mrs. A. O. and 3 children. Bean, Edward. Bean, Mrs. Ethel. Bryhe, Miss D. Beasley, Mr. L. Brown, Mr. T.W.S. Brown, Miss E. Brown, Mrs. Benton, Lillian W. Bystron, Carolina. Bright, Dagmar. Bright, Daisy. Clark, Mrs. Ada. Cameron, Miss C. Caldwell, Albert F. Caldwell, Mrs. Sylvan. Caldwell, Alden, infant. Christie, Mr. and Mrs. Collier, Mrs. Charlotte. Collier, Miss Marjorie. Christie, Miss Alice. Colette, Stithard. Krista, Miss Disha. Charles, William. Croft, Millie Mall. Doling, Mrs. Elise. Drew, Mrs. Lulu. Davis, Mrs. Agnes. Davis, Miss Mary. Davis, John M. Duvan, Florentine. Duvan, Mibbs A. Davidson, Miss Mary. Doling, Miss Ada. Driscoll, Mrs. B. Dystrom, Caroline. Encarnacion, Mrs. Ronaldo. Fawnthorpe, Mrs. Lizzie. Formery, Miss Ellen. Garside, Ethel. Garachi, Mrs. Marcy. Genovese, Angier. Hart, Mrs. Esther. Hart, Eva. Harris, George. Hewlett, Mrs. Mary. Heber, Miss S. Hoffman, Lola. Hoffman, Lewis. Harper, Nina. Hold, Stephen. Hold, Mrs. Anna. Hawking, Mr. and Mrs. George. Hawking, Miss Nellie. Herman, Mrs. Jane, 2 daughters. Healy, Nora. Hanson, Jeannie. Hamathian, W. Hamathian, Anna. Harnlin, Anna and child. Elette, Bertha. Jackson, Mrs. Amy. Juliet, Levinch. Jerwan, Mary. Juhan Poldrel. Jacobson, Mrs. Keene, Miss Nora H. Kelly, Mrs. F. Cantar, Mrs. A. Leitch, Jessie. LaRoche, Mrs. and Miss Simone. LaRoche, Miss Louise. Lehman, Bertha. Launch, Mrs. Alex. Lenore, Amelia. Lystrom, Mrs. C. Mellinger, Elizabeth. Mellinger, child. Marshall, Mrs. Kate. Mallette, A. Mallette, Mrs. and child. Mange, Paula. Mayor, Mrs. Florence. Miller, W.J. McDermott, Miss Layla. McGowan, Anna. Nye, Elizabeth. Nasser, Mrs. Delilah. Noosa, Mrs. A. Oxenham, Percy J. Phillips, Alice. Palace, Emilio. Padro, Jitleon. Prinsky, Rosa. Portatilli, Emilio. Parsh, Mrs. L. Plett, B. Quick, Mrs. Jane. Quick, Mrs. Vera W. Quick, Miss Phyllis. Renardo, Miss E. Ridgedale, Lucy. Renoff, Mrs. Lily. Rugg, Miss Emily. Richards, M. Rogers, Miss Selina. Richards, Mrs. Amelia, 2 boys, and Mr. Richards, Jr. Simpson, Miss. Sincock, Miss Maud. Sinconin, Anna. Smith, Miss Marion. Sylvan, Lyle. Trant, Mrs. J. Toomey, Miss E. Trout, Miss E. Trout, Miss Cecilia. Ware, Miss H. Water, Miss N. Wilhelm, CBAS. Watt, Mrs. A. and 2 children. Williams, Ricarbard, M. Jr. Wise, Matilda. Weber, Miss Sajist. Wright, Miss Marion. Wright, Miss Marion. Watt, Miss Bessie. Watt, Miss Betka. West, Mrs. E.A. West, Miss Constance. West, Miss Barbara. Wells, Addie. Wells, Master. A list of surviving third cabin passengers and crew is omitted owing to the impossibility of obtaining the correct names of many. Roll call of the dead. First cabin. Allison, H.J. Allison, Mrs. and maid. Allison, Miss. Andrews, Thomas. Astor, Colonel J.J. and servant. Anderson, Walker. Beatty, T. Brandeis, E. Buckneville, Mrs. William, maid of. Ballman, J. Baxter, Mr. and Mrs. Quigg. Bjornstrom, H. Burnham, Jacob. Blackwell, S.W. Burbank, J.J. Bowen, Miss. Brady, John B. Brew, Arl. Butt, Major A. Clark, Walter M. Clifford, George Q. Coley, E.P. Cardeza, T.D.M., servant of. Cardeza, Mrs. J.W., maid of. Carlson, Frank. Corin, F.M. Corin, J.P. Chaffee, Mr. H.I. Chisholm, Robert. Compton, A.T. Crafton, John B. Crosby, Edward G. Cummings, John Bradley. Dooley's, William C. Douglas, W.D. Douglas, Master R., nurse of. Evans, Miss E. Fortune, Mark. Foreman, V.L. Fortune, Charles. Franklin, T.P. Futrell, J. G. Arthur. Goldenberg, E.L. Goldschmidt, G.B. Giglio, Victor. Guggenheim, Benjamin. Hayes, Charles M. Hayes, Mrs. Charles, maid of. Head, Christopher. Hilliard, H.H. Hipkins, W.E. Hogenheim, Mrs. A. Harris, Henry B. Harp, Mr. and Mrs. Charles M. Harp, Miss Margaret and maid. Holverson, A.M. Islam, Miss A.E. Ismay, J. Bruce, servant of. Julian, H.F. Jones, C.C. Kent, Edward A. Kenyon, Mr. and Mrs. F.R. Claber, Herman. Lamberth, William, F.F. Lawrence, Arthur. Long, Milton. Lewy, E.J. Loping, J.H. Lingry, Edward. McGuire, J.E. McCaffrey, T. McCaffrey, T. Jr. McCarthy, T. Middleton, J.C. Millet, Frank D. Minahan, Dr. Meyer, Edgar J. Molson, H.M. Moore, C. Servant. Newell, Miss T. Nicholson, A.S. Parr, M.H.W. Pierce, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas. Penasco, Mr. and Mrs. Victor. Partner, M.A. Payne, Y. Puffer, C.C. Robert, Mrs. E., maid of. Roebling, Washington, A. the 2nd. Rood, Hugh. Rose, J. Hugo. Rothes, Countess, maid of. Rothschild, M. Ryerson, A. Sylvie, William B. Spencer, W. A. Steed, W. T. Stone, Mrs. George, maid of. Strauss, Mr. and Mrs. Isidore. Sutton, Frederick. Smart, John. Smith, Clinch. Smith, L. P. Taussig, Emil. Thayer, Mrs. maid of. Thayer, John B. Thorne, G. Vanderhoof, Wyckoff. Walker, W. A. Warren, F. M. White, Percival A. White, Richard F. Widener, G. D. Widener, Harry. Wood, Mr. and Mrs. Frank P. Weir, J. Williams, Dwayne. Wright, George. Second cabin. Abelson, Sampson. Andrew, Frank. Ashby, John. Aldworth, C. Andrew, Edgar. Bracken, James. Brown, Mrs. Bright, Narl. Bailey, Percy. Bainbridge, C.R. Biles, the Reverend Thomas. Beauchamp, H.G. Berg, Ms. E. Bentham, I. Bateman, Robert J. Butler, Reginald. Botsford, Hull. Bowiener, Solomon. Clark, Charles. Clark, bandsman. Corey, Mrs. C.P. Carter, the Reverend Ernest. Carter, Mrs. Coleridge, Reginald. Chapman, Charles. Cunningham, Alfred. Campbell, William. Corbett, Mrs. Irene. Chapman, John E. Chapman, Mrs. E. Colander, Eric. Cotterill, Harvey. Deacon, Percy. Davis, Charles. Dibben, William. DeBrito, Jose. Denborney, H. Drew, James. Drew, Master M. David, Master J. W. Downton, W. J. Dilvarlo, S. Dilvarlo, Mrs. Frost, A. Finnery, Mr. Faunthorpe, H. Philbrook, C. Funk, Annie. Falstrom, A. Fox, Stanley, W. Greenberg, S. Giles, Ralph. Gaskell, Alfred. Gillespie, William. Gilbert, William. Gall, S. Gall, John. Giles, Edgar. Giles, Fred. Gale, Harry. Garvey, Lawrence. Hickman, Leonard. Hickman, Linvis. Hume, bandsman. Hickman, Stanley. Hood, Ambrose. Hodges, Henry. Hart, Benjamin. Harris, Walter. Harper, John. Harbeck, W. H. Hoffman, Mr. Herman, Mrs. S. Howard, B. Hale, Reginald. Hunt, George. Jacobson, Mr. Jacobson, Sidney. Jeffrey, Clifford. Jeffrey, Ernest. Jenkins, Stephen. Jarvis, John D. Keene, Daniel. Kirkland, Reverend C. Carnes, Mrs. F. G. Krillner, J. H. Krenz, bandsman. Cantor, Selena. Knight, R. Lingham, John. Levy, R. J. Loch, Charles. Layson, W. R. N. LaRoche, Joseph. Lamb, J. J. McCain, Peter. Milling, Jacob. Malachard, Noel. Morawick, Dr. McCrae, Arthur G. McCry, James M. McCain, Peter D. Mudd, Thomas. Mack, Mrs. Mary. Marshall, Henry. Mayberg, Frank H. Meyer, August. Miles, Thomas. Mitchell, Henry. Matthew, W. J. Nesson, Israel. Nicholas, Joseph C. Norman, Robert D. Otter, Richard. Phillips, Robert. Poncel, Martin. Payne, Alfred. Parks, Frank. Pengelly, F. Pernot, Renee. Parker, Clifford. Polbaum, Frank. Renoff, Peter H. Rogers, Harry. Reeves, David. Sobey, Hayden. Slatter, Miss H. M. Stanton, Ward. Sword, Hans K. Stokes, Philip J. Sharp, Percival. Sedgwick, Mr. F. W. Smith, Augustus. Sweet, George. Taylor, Bandsman. Turpin, William J. Turpin, Mrs. Dorothy. Turner, John H. Tiervin, Mrs. A. Veal, James. Watson, E. Woodward, Bandsman. Ware, William J. Wise, Leopold. Whedon, Edward. Ware, John J. West, E. Arthur. Wheeler, Edwin. Werman, Samuel. The total death list was 1,635. Third cabin passengers and crew are not included in the list here, given owing to the impossibility of obtaining the exact names of many. End of the roll call. Part 2, Chapter 12.